Hello, friends. This is the AlphaList podcast. I am your host, Toby. The goal of the AlphaList podcast is to empower CTOs with the info and insight they need to make the best decisions for the company. We do this by hosting top thought leaders and picking their brains for insights into technical leadership and tech trends. If you believe in the power of accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. Plus, if you're an experienced CTO, you will love the discussion happening in our Slack space where over 600 CTOs are sharing insights, or visit one of our events. Just go to alphalist.com to apply. Welcome to the AlphaList podcast. I'm your host, Toby, and today with me is Daniel Bartholomae, the CTO and Managing Director of optilyz, a company that transforms direct mail into a modern, agile marketing channel for the enterprise. Daniel, was that correct?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. We send basically postcards and letters from Canada to New Zealand. And obviously, we are not necessarily on those letters, but you might already have gotten something from us if you are working, or if you are subscribed, for example, to HelloFresh or to any other major e-commerce or retail brand.
That means that I can send, handwritten postcards where I generate the texts with an LLM to people around the world, I guess.
Yeah, and they don't need to be handwritten. I think most of them at the moment are still just normally digitally printed, but handwritten is definitely also an option.
I think it converts better, right?
But it's also significantly more expensive. So you need to find the right combination for the right use case. For example, one thing we often talk about with our customers is that don't send a physical letter if you can send an email. It's just cheaper. Only send the physical letter than for the customers where the email didn't work. And that's basically what we offer, the ability to mix and match channels so that you can do it in the best possible way.
Okay. And today we're here to talk about your approach of building teams. We come to that a bit later because you basically call it cross-functional team members and not cross-functional teams. Let's looking forward to that. Beforehand, I'd like to start with basically your nerd path. Like, how did you personally get into computing? Like, why are you fascinated by what you're doing? Like, would you consider yourself a nerd or not? All of that. So let's start with that.
I think I would definitely fall into that category, but I would say that I have a bit of an unconventional path towards where I'm right now. So I did have a lot of contact as a child. My father was actually working as a developer before he retired, and I had my first contact with Pascal ST on the Atari ST, I think with 6 years or so. And that was quite interesting. And then during school was definitely important. At university, I was doing math and physics, so also nerdy topics. But my first full-time job was as a consultant at McKinsey. So working on strategy, and not even as a consultant at McKinsey focusing on the technical topics. There was one area there which was more focused on those, but I wasn't part of that. And I did have more technical topics in the sense of working with telcos, with chip manufacturers and companies that were doing software. But what I did mostly was working on innovation strategy. So helping them to understand what does all of this new tech stuff actually mean for us and for our company, and how can we be on the winning side instead of being on the losing side with this. And after being there for, I think, 5-ish years, I realized that consulting is mainly sales, and at least after some point, and that's not necessarily what I enjoyed most. So I started to jump into the Berlin startup scene, founded some things myself, joined other companies, and that's what brought me in the end to optilyz, where I'm now, where I joined as CTO after the company already had been around for a while. And now I'm also managing director since a bit more than a year. But I'm not one of the founders there. So in the end, CTO was my first official technical role. I never was a developer or something like that in between.
Ah, okay, interesting. And do you miss that every once in a while, or do you, code every few times, or like how would you describe your day to day? I think it's also important for the people to know like how big is your team actually, like because that often goes hand in hand with like, do I do hands-on coding or not, right?
Yeah, that's definitely true. We're not a gigantic company. We're around 40 people, and we have at the moment 2 developer teams. So it's not extremely big, but at the same time, I actually don't code as much nowadays anymore. I did a bit more in my earlier jobs, obviously, as in my earlier CTO roles, which were also at a bit more smaller companies. And I just today actually touched a bit of code again because I try to stay in focus. But I also realized beginning of this year that I'm moving a bit more from being CTO and managing director to being managing director and CTO. So I spend a bit more time now on overall business topics than I did before. I still try to keep sharp. So I do run some coding katas from time to time here in Berlin for other people. I've been organizing conference around this, and I do a bit of open source contribution. But at the company itself, the main thing I try to make sure is that if I touch code, then it's fine if it does not get merged for a month, because if it has to get merged in a month, then I'm a blocker and that wouldn't work.
Okay, and you potentially also arrange like the work infrastructure, which often involves technical knowledge and maybe coding, but not necessarily is on the critical path of the product, I guess.
Yeah, in practice, the most technical things I do, I think, are in the alignments with my teams. So we have alignments every second Friday, and in these alignments, they usually have questions and then want some input, or also if there's questions in between, they just put something to my calendar, and then we have a discussion around what could the architecture look like here, or there's this especially gnarly bug and we have no clue how to actually approach it. And I think I'm no longer in the company the person that is best suited to answer all of these, which I think is a bit of a good thing, because that's what I aim for when building teams, that they run more or less independently. But for especially architectural topics, when it goes across the full company, then obviously I usually still have the biggest knowledge about what's the overall structure and where might we be headed with that.
Do you use LLMs for coding these days? Like if you do something yourself, like do you use, I don't know, GPT or Charles or whatever?
So I've tried a bit, especially over the last month. I have a GitHub Copilot running now for a year or so. But actually, after experimenting more with this and also experimenting more on the team, we most likely will shut it down again because it didn't give us as much benefit as we thought. I recently tried out Cursor, which also is quite interesting because it's basically a new IDE approach, focusing fully on if you thought LLM first, how would your IDE look like? But at the moment, I'm still, let's say, stuck a bit in the old approach of refactoring with help of refactoring tools, where if you make a change, it will not break anything because it's written so that none of the changes can actually break something. They're purely refactors, and I'm significantly faster with that than having to create some code via the IDE and then check it. But I did find one interesting approach that worked so far the best of these, which is I'm a big proponent of TDD, test-driven design. We do a lot of that. And that in combination with LLMs actually work quite nicely because you can use the LLM to create a test, and the test is easy to read. So you immediately know, well, after looking at it, is this actually what I wanted to test? And then you use LLM to create the code that fulfills the test. And this might not be easy to read, but you have the test. So the test tells you, does it actually do what I think it does? So in combination with TDD, it worked surprisingly well. And that's the combination which I think also for me is still the most relevant.
Okay. Could be the future of coding that you basically write specs, right? Instead of necessarily the code.
I mean, in the end, code is spec, so it's the same thing. It's just a question of how to put it into multiple steps. And therefore, the spec itself then just needs to be specific enough, or you need to be able to check that it does the right thing.
Yeah, right. That's what I mean. So let's start with like painting a tech picture. Like, how does the stack of optilyz look like?
We are mainly on AWS at the moment. For us, what's actually the interesting tech from a business perspective? A lot of it isn't that interesting because it's enterprise customers. You don't have many users. You don't have requirements for this to be running in a lot of different ways. On Lyft, you don't even need a mobile version because who wants to do their mobile, their daily work on mobile? Some do, but especially in our case, you don't book a campaign 10 times a day. You book these kind of campaigns for each company, maybe once a week. So it's a very rare use case. And the more interesting part that also gets a bit more complicated is how we deal with the address data, because in the end, what we need to know is who do you want the postcard or the letter to be sent to. And this address data, on one hand, needs to be really secure. There's a lot of GDPR concerns in this, but also our customers use their marketing cloud to send this, and marketing clouds don't always do exactly what you hope they would do. So, for example, one issue we had to solve is what happens if one of the marketing clouds decides to just send 1 million records in 2 milliseconds? How do we handle this? That's not an enormous number of records, but it's extremely bursty compared to other setups where you have a continuous amount of data flowing in. Especially if you need to think about what if the marketing cloud doesn't have retry? What if it doesn't follow the usual protocols that you would expect a system to follow? Our customers are not working at the marketing cloud. Our customers are working at another company, so they don't have an influence. And in the end, who will they blame? They will blame us. So we need to be extremely fault tolerant around things that are happening in a system we don't control. That's where a lot of interesting challenges come from. And in the end, we are... Nowadays, we are, as mentioned, on AWS a lot with serverless. This also comes back to the question of how to organize teams, because serverless gives us a lot of benefits there. And I'm sure we'll get into that a bit later today. And then apart from that, I think GitHub as default almost nowadays is important for us. And Slack also takes a huge part of our development workflow. But for task management, that's maybe the last interesting point. We don't use Jira anymore. We are basically using Miro and Asana as a task management tool. But the typical planning that you would do, we do that basically in Miro with help of mind maps and other more visual structures.
Interesting. I also every once in a while ask myself, like, hey, is Jira really the answer? Like, do you actually win something through having this, like, let's say, tool that is deeply made for technical people, while in most cases you try to rather solve business problems and product challenges, right? And like for me, it's also not as useful anymore as like back in the 90s.
In the end, Jira is made for engineering managers. It's not necessarily even made for engineers themselves. It's a tool that makes it easy to get an overview of how tickets flow. And for example, I mean, we're not that big of a company, which definitely helps for this. But in general, I'm a big fan of trying to trust your teams and build a structure where you don't need to look at every single ticket, and you can still just look at the business results, for example, of each team. We do that every 2 weeks, and the business results every 2 weeks, if they are fine, I don't really care how people manage their tickets. And if something works better for them, that it works better. It's just that in practice for us, this has then come to flow mostly into Miro for things like user story mapping and related plans or architectural diagrams, and Asana because that's the tool that the rest of the company uses. And this makes it significantly easier to collaborate with the sales team, with our internal operations team, which is not tech ops, but they are the ones handling our printers, or with our customer success team.
Yeah, that sounds really good. That you really like align on a few simple tools that like the whole company uses and don't overcomplicate processes, right? I mean, so many engineering departments are driven by the idea of producing something in 2-week cycles, which in many companies for me ends being meaningful, like the results that you deliver. Like often it's just to deliver, and you follow that cycle, and you're kind of in a spiral of death, where you really try to follow those 2 weekly sprints that can lead to something meaningful or not. So I for example also like Shape Up, where you rather try to really solve a problem, right? Instead of trying to press everything into those 2 weeks. How do you see that?
Yeah, we do have some ideas also taken from ShapeUp. We do have the 2-week sprint in some way, but I think the major differences are that we don't actually have a separate product management. We don't have product managers that decide the what and then engineers that decide the how, but each team is responsible for the product management of their own area, which makes it significantly easier than doing the 2 weeks, for example, to switch topic if it makes sense, because everyone has the context. So you don't need one big sprint planning up front and everything needs to be prepared for this one point of failure, but everyone is part of the user research. The developers are running their own user research sessions. They get the context, and therefore they can more easily decide what they want to focus on to actually move the business needle. And that takes away this idea of we just want to deliver something after 2 weeks and moves more towards we want to improve the business outcome. For me, one of the things, for example, about Scrum that I do understand where it comes from, and there are a lot of companies where it makes a lot of sense as a first step, but the idea that you don't change what you're working on in the 2 weeks to me also leads to absurd situations where you say, hey, it's day 1 of the 2 weeks. We just realized that the thing we're working on is absolutely valueless. Let's spend the remaining 9 days to continue working on that. That's not how you want your team to act. And especially if you have a separation where the product managers need to make decisions and the developers just need to follow them, then you need to have some kind of wall to protect developers so they have their own time. But if that's no longer the case, if you actually have the developers knowing what priorities are and taking care of that as well, then it's totally fine that they decide, hey, we learned something new, we just change our direction now.
And that they talk to business, for example, directly, or talk to a customer directly. If you have that separation between business and tech, it also often gets complicated, right? But still, you should, like, if you have it, allow your developers to talk to the business side as well, instead of being the bottleneck that, or having bottlenecks installed instead of you, that actually try to kind of abstract and transport knowledge, right?
And for me, this also already comes down a bit to this idea of cross-functional team members, of having people in the team who can both write code, but also can join a sales call with a prospective customer, understand their problem, and bring that back to the team. And that's how we are set up right now, where the customer research sessions, the discussions where sales needs some support, they happen together with the developers that then actually work on this. And we got a lot of positive feedback from the customers. Obviously, they love to be able to talk to the people that can actually tell them what will happen and what will not happen. But also a lot of positive feedback from the developers, because it allows them to really make the right decision and not just follow something that they don't believe in.
So your developers are kind of product managers, developers, designers. What else? Everything in one brain, or?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different roles. There's definitely product management. There is developer, full stack developer. There is DevOps in there. There is design in there. There's a bit of project management. There is a bit of marketing. For example, when we create a new feature, the team that creates the feature usually also writes the email to announce it to the customers, which in other companies might be more of a product marketing or marketing task. And therefore, there's a lot of things coming together. And I can already hear some people sitting in front of their screens or their phones thinking, oh, that's impossible. You can't do that. And there are definitely drawbacks to this. I think one thing to keep in mind is we're not a gigantic company. Hiring the people we have right now took us some time. If we were to double the number of engineers every year, then I think this approach might not work, just because there are not enough engineers necessarily out there who actually want to do that. Not necessarily saying about the skills, that's a separate issue, but even just wanting this. There's a lot of people out there who prefer to get that ticket, work through the ticket, be left alone, and then be done with it. But that doesn't work if you need to also talk to the customers, do the prioritization, and so on.
And what are the main skills or personality traits that you look for then?
The main thing I'm looking for is A, interest in this kind of work style, and B, learning ability. So one of my favorite interview questions, for example, for a developer is, hey, you just mentioned, or I saw on your CV, you mainly do React work. What's the last interesting thing you learned about React? What's a bug you ran into or something that you found somewhere else? What did you find interesting? What did you learn? And if someone then doesn't have any answer to that and says, oh, yeah, so 1 year ago, I looked at this, then I know they're maybe not that learning focused. And if they have an answer that is, oh, I recently learned that there's this concept of hooks in React, then this also gives me a picture of what's their technical understanding. So that's how I look for making sure that they are interested in learning. But I would not underestimate also interest in actually working in this kind of way, because what we learned there is that for those who do want this, they're extremely loyal, because you don't get that in many companies. In a lot of companies, you just sit there, get your tickets, and if you do want to take some influence on the direction, you end up doing just politics. And that's something these people don't like, because they're builders. But for those who then join us, they see this is something that works for them quite well, and they really, really want to keep that.
Understood. And do you have then a certain way to onboard people to kind of make sure that they are perfectly suited and aligned for this style of working? Like, do you train people on product management specifically, or do you just like throw people into the cold water, as we say in Germany, and it works? Or
it's a bit of a mixture. We do have some specific trainings. So one thing maybe first that is really important here: every second Friday at optilyz for a product team is Learning Friday. Learning Friday means that you can learn whatever you find most important for you. And usually there's still some work happening. There are some meetings that can't be moved, or people who are still having something left over from Thursday and they just want to finish it up. But at least half a day usually is then still spent on learning something. And that helps, because you do need time to actually learn these new things, even if you're really interested. We also use these Learning Fridays to have some specific trainings available. So if we see that there is, for example, a team struggling with creating user story maps to really understand how the demands they heard from the team translate into concrete features, then we just do a learning session there. And that's I think also one of the main contributions that I still have around this, where I can then run these sessions and really understand from the context what is actually missing, and then teach that specific part. But there's also a bit of throwing into the cold water, because one other thing that we do a lot, I mentioned already TDD, test-driven design. One other development concept that worked extremely well for us is ensemble programming, sometimes also called mob programming, where instead of everyone sitting on their own, the team sits together in one call. One person has the keyboard and writes, and the others discuss. And there's a bit more to it. I know that if you just do it like this, it most likely won't work. So it's like many other things, a tool you need to know how to use and you need to learn. But this makes it extremely easy to onboard people, because if they realize, hey, I've never done a user research session, they just do a user research session with someone else. And there's a pattern usually where you join and you don't contribute much. And then maybe next time someone else says, okay, you can do it, and I'll give you feedback afterwards. But because of all of these things happening in each team, these skills are then distributed in the team quite quickly.
Cool. Are you remote, or are you Berlin based, or?
We are fully remote. We do have most people in Germany right now, but also across Europe.
Okay, interesting. And were there which were the challenges that you encountered when you introduced that model, and when was that I don't know, that moment when you said, let's do this? Was that like a decision, or did that pivot towards that automatically, or?
It was a bit gradual. So I joined around 3.5 years ago or so. And when I joined, very first month, I negotiated with the CEO, you're currently doing CTO, do it 1 more month. I will just observe so that I can get a good picture. I don't make any changes in the first month. And then until end of this year, so over the next 3-4 months, I restructured from having a front-end development team, a back-end development team, a QA team, a product management team, and a design team, towards having cross-functional teams as a very first step, which already was really, really helpful, because I still remember to this day, this 1 week in the first month where we had meetings, and I joined the meetings, and the meeting with the front-end developers could not progress because we needed some information from the designers. So we waited, and the information came in the next day in the meeting with the designers. though it didn't, because they needed some information from QA. And then we literally spent the full week going around, not coming to a conclusion. That was the first change.
Receive letter, open envelope, read content, send to QA, or process some work, send to QA. QA receives it, sends it back. Can't work with that. Yeah.
So that was the first change, to actually go to cross-functional teams. But there we still had different roles with team members. We did have product management as separate roles, front end separate, back end separate. And then over time, we first converged by hiring to be more full stack. So we didn't have front end and back end. And also we moved QA to be done by the developers. The next step was actually to have in one of the teams, we had the product management then no longer be done separately, because there was no product manager anymore in the team. And we had split up into more teams. While in another team, the next step was actually that the team started to doing their own design work, because the designer left at that point. And then over time, over the next years, it developed. And I would say that for a year or so now, we are working very explicitly in this cross-functional team member style, where we don't have product managers very explicitly, or we don't have designers very explicitly, but instead different people taking different roles. And there are still strengths and weaknesses. It's as usual. Also, if you will always have a front-end developer that knows more CSS and a front-end developer that knows more about state management in React. And similarly to this, some of our people know more about design, some know more about product management, some know more about backend or so. But all of them are at least interested in touching the different topics and are learning. And that's the combination that makes it so powerful.
Yeah, right. I mean, you have that automatically, right? Like, even if you have like a, let's say, relatively modern stack with React and Node.js and TypeScript. So like everyone knows basically the language, but still you will have some, I don't know, pros who like front-end more and some who like back-end more, etc., right?
And the language is a good point, because there's also a technical aspect to this. You can't expect teams to work across all of these different areas if each of them is very complicated and specialized. We made a lot of choices around our architecture, around our tooling, towards driven by the idea that it's not the best thing to do for this specific situation, but the best thing for someone who needs to handle multiple topics. This means that we have an easy way to book user research sessions. It's just a link that you can share with customers, and we share it also other ways. And then everything else, everything related to GDPR happens automatically. Everything related to booking and putting into calendars happens automatically. There's a very clear, easy way what you need to do. You should always record. We have a Slack channel. Everything gets posted there automatically. And you get a reminder thereby that you should also write the summary in this one Slack channel. And the same is true on the technical side. That's where the serverless topic came for us up. We did have a bit of Terraform when I joined. Terraform does not scale nicely if you need to have application developers learn it. There is a lot of power in there, but a lot of power means that you need to spend a lot of time to learn it potentially. And that's what drove us over time more towards using serverless, and specifically also AWS CDK for infrastructure as code, where you write code, and it's digital code, not configuration, in the same language that you write your front end and your back end. And you can abstract things in the same way, so that if one developer figured out how do we connect our database to a Lambda via VPC, then the others don't need to, and they don't need to copy something. They just import from this one module, I want a Lambda that is connected to this VPC, and then that works. So a lot of technical decisions also are affected by the idea that we want to have people work across a lot of different areas.
Okay. That means that you're relatively locked into AWS, I guess, but that's, I don't know, a thing you can accept, right? You can negotiate with them, etc. But on the other hand, it makes it very, let's say, flow-driven, right? Like you have people that also, like, or your developers are really like true DevOps as well. And you don't need someone who, I don't know, maintains Terraform, which for me is a terrible experience. Then when you have one person in the company that actually manages the Terraform stuff and tries to build or tries to maintain what the others kind of build, that's not great, right?
Yeah, and it always leads to the same handover situation that we want to avoid. I think I didn't talk much about handovers yet, but that's for me the main enemy, so to say, in this kind of flow.
Yeah.
Whenever you need to hand over, then even if the task just takes a minute, you will actually need to wait for at least an hour usually, because the other person isn't available right away. This multiplies up so quickly that if that things take significantly longer, you start to jump more between topics, you lose focus. And being able to just focus the full team on the one thing that is now most important makes this so much easier.
Mm-hmm. And for the receiver, let's say you had a DevOps person, right? And you decided which kind of, I don't know, the title is again misleading if you don't dev but only do ops, right? Then you would have that additional context which comes on top for the person, right? For the receiver, like you send a message, you want something to get done, and then you send it to someone else, and that someone else may be busy with something else, and then has to context switch, and then has to switch back, like do the task, switch back, return the work. Like that's very inefficient. And I think what you do there is, I don't know if it's like if you got there by nature or through like your flow or your like a decision as well, is a very good setup for B2B SaaS, I think, because the tech stuff itself is not super complicated. There's no super complicated infrastructure normally. It's kind of boring, let's say, right? If you ask engineers like, hey, I want to do Rust, etc., then this is like exactly the wrong setup for like a B2B SaaS company like yours, where the complexity is really in the processes that you're automating, and the fact that you really do that successful, right? That you execute those processes in a successful way, even though people deal with external dependencies that might not be able to, or might not be as deterministic as you think, right? That's basically, I think, for B2B SaaS, a perfect setup.
Yes, exactly. And I think it goes a bit also with this movement that happens to have more CPTOs around, where we realize that in a lot of situations nowadays, technology isn't just technology, but it's an enabler for something else, and this something else is the main thing. But to be able to do this, you still need to have the technological understanding. And similar to how we do this in the executive groups now, by having CPTOs who know both and who are responsible for the actual business outcome, and no longer only for some vague or unclear technological question. This is what we did on the team level to make sure that everyone in the team is responsible, or even the individual level in the team, that everyone individually is responsible for the business outcome, and not necessarily for just finding the nicest tech solution.
Exactly. I think that's a very good direction, because keeping the lights on is just not enough, right? I think it's also much more challenging and much more fun than thinking about the next Cassandra, to really think about like, what are you actually influencing? What is the impact of your organization?
And like you said, there's definitely also companies where this is not true. We just talked about B2B SaaS, where the business processes are the ones that are causing the main challenge. And there are companies where the technical challenge is the main challenge. If the technical challenge is the main challenge, then focus on that. But that's a business strategy question. What is actually the most important thing for us as a company? And then I always say engineering strategy follows product strategy, follows business strategy. If you try to do it the other way around, and you start with engineering strategy and say, hey, but we need Terraform, without even understanding what the company does, then you will most likely end up in a very painful situation.
Yeah, I agree. In the prep call, you said that you use something you call architectural design or architectural decision records, ADRs, to basically document architectural decisions. Why and how did you introduce it, and how do you handle that?
So one of the problems you run into if you have everyone doing DevOps is that everyone can do their own thing, and it's very easy to end up in a system that is looking very different. So you need to be explicit about some decisions that you do not want people to second guess every week. For example, for us, we work in TypeScript and JavaScript for some of the systems that haven't been converted yet, but we do not add any other language without an explicit discussion across the full company. And the easiest way that I found to have these kind of information in a readable format is with ADRs, which is basically a short thing that starts with, hey, this is our decision. And then continues with, and this is why we took it, and this is the context in which we took it, which is really important because we also have decisions that sound like, hey, we are using this specific library. Why? Because it was in the system when we started doing ADRs, and we didn't feel at the time that it was worth it to look into it. And also, half of the developers knew it quite well. So if you then, a few years later, look at this and you realize, actually, the developers that knew it well all left, and this library is now causing problems, it's really easy to see that the decision is just no longer valid and you can take a new one. So that's something that helps us a lot to communicate. It's not perfect because, as usual, if it's documentation and not code, then it will not always be on people's mind. And we do have situations where people forget that there is an ADR that is a bit smaller, that they didn't affect them recently, and then build something that actually contradicts the ADR. But at least it does come up then over time, and we can see, okay, we need to steer course again. We need to change direction here. So the cost is lower than if it just grows and no one ever notices. And we even use it for recruiting because our tech radar, together with the ADRs, is something we can share with with the people who apply, and then they know upfront what is actually the technical setup that I'm getting into. What are the decisions that were taken that I might not be happy with. And last but not least, how do we actually create these ADRs? This is for us at the moment a bit of a passage ride towards higher levels as a developer, where for one specific jump from what we call senior developer 1 to senior developer 2, you are expected to create cross-team influence. And the cross-team influence usually comes with an ADR. The ADR itself isn't enough because if you just write something down, people won't do it. You need to actually work across teams, talk with people, understand what's going on in the different teams to be able to help. But it's a bit of the written outcome out of this. And we, in our ADRs, have even one ADR talking about how do we create ADRs, because we realized at some point that this was unclear and we just wanted to write it down. And this was the most natural spot to put it, which allows us now to say, if you want to have a decision, this is then bring it to our product alignment. It's what is the meeting that's called. This is just the product teams meeting with each other and bringing up topics in a lean coffee format. So no one owner of the agenda, but everyone can bring in topics. And then we discuss something. And if everyone is in favor, we just merge. Otherwise, it's typically kept open for 2 more weeks and people can give more feedback. And sometimes it also takes a bit longer to find a good solution. But that's where the ADRs came in quite handy for us.
Coming back to the original topic, like how do you envision this model to evolve, like this cross-functional team member model? Do you think like if you further grow, it will still work efficiently, or do you see that there's like a natural end of the road?
I think that after a certain size, it becomes hard, mainly due to hiring, because I did spend, I think, full weeks just going from half an hour interview to half an hour interview until actually finding people that were interested and able to do this. And I'm really happy that I did this, because it means that nowadays the teams just work and I don't need to tell them every single decision, but I just have my bi-weekly alignment, and that mostly is it, unless they need some specific input that they then explicitly ask for. But I think that's the main limitation. The second one, I think, is that the more you grow with this kind of model, the more you need to think about how does your platform team work. And platform becomes a really broad term. I already mentioned that we have tooling for booking user research sessions. That's part of the platform for a cross-functional team like this, because that's something they need to do. And in an ideal world, they don't need to think about all of these things, but they can just follow process and focus on the content. And at our size, it's easy enough that if one of the teams doesn't really have something there, so let's say the first team runs into the problem of connecting our Lambda to a VPC database, then just the team that runs into it takes it and does something with it. But with more and more teams, you need to actually have teams enabling the team. So the way we called it in between was a product enablement team or enable team. And these can be hard to set up because they still need to be customer focused, just with different customers. If they just build whatever technology they fancy the most, it won't work because they will build something and no one will use it. So the very typical problems that you anyways have with product enablement teams or with platform teams or DevX teams, you have this 10 times as big, because if it does not work, then the teams will be just overwhelmed. You will not be able to scale up. So I'd say that there is a way to make this work also with more people if you can hire slowly enough and you can set up the teams, but it is harder. I would also say that I assume this to become more common, which also means it will be easier to hire for it because there will be more people who have experienced it. So it might not yet be the time to do this in really big teams, but that time I think will definitely come.
Okay. And yeah, for optilyz, the question is also like, is it meaningful to grow your engineering teams to, 50 plus people, right? Because you're solving a very specific question. And I don't know, in B2B SaaS, like also from my perspective, a good benchmark is to look at revenue per FTE. So, and then, if revenue grows and you don't have to grow necessarily FTEs, and why not do that, right? You're more profitable then.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think there are potentially also still challenges in our area, especially if you think about international mail. US has a lot of very different formats, which, because the main challenges for us are coming from the business side, then translate to challenges on the technical of the technical teams. But also from just looking at the last years, my experience was that due to this focus, the teams just get more done than the teams I've been working with, which were less cross-functional, because you just spend so much less time on handovers and other things, which means that I don't think that for us specifically, we need to grow to thousands of engineers to do what we do well. And therefore, it's an easy choice for me to go with this direction because I have all the benefits, but I don't need to worry about hiring 1,000 people like this.
Great. I like that approach. So slowly coming to the end, really like the discussion. What's something surprising about working in direct mail automation? Any misconceptions or hidden challenges that you didn't expect?
That's a good question. I think one thing that is always surprising, or not always, but that is surprising. A lot of people say, "Oh, but isn't mail a dying channel?" And the thing is, it's the other way around, because people get less mail, which means that the mail they do get stands out more, so the channel becomes more important. The main challenge on the channel is that it's expensive, and it will be more and more expensive. So you need to really focus on sending to only those people which where you have a conversion. If you just spam everyone, you're just wasting a lot of money. And that's why, for example, our software solution is so important, because it allows you to use the same kind of segmentation that you use for email, also for your physical mail, and completely automate it and reach people at the right point in time. But if you think about it just from the old way of sending big catalogs to everyone in your user database, then that doesn't sound like it will work, because this actually won't. So I think that's one very typical discussion that comes up when I talk about direct mail, and that is not expected by some people.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Yesterday I looked at a tool that recently got a lot of funding, 11x, like a company that sends, like a German company, I think, that sends AI-generated mail, like not snail mail, but email to people, even does the address research, etc. Most likely this will lead, like if many people use it, this will lead to more email fatigue, right? I don't know, we need better spam filters. And this potentially is a chance, like if you're smart in marketing, to use the channels that are dying, or that people think that are dying, and where people get less load. And I think like phone will potentially start getting more useful again. Well, this will be also used by AI. And then letters, right?
Phone, as soon as we figure out a good way to automate this without having to have every single call be made by one human, then this channel will change at that point. And one other nice example is the so-called fridge effect. If you have an email and you don't like it, you delete it, that's out of your mind a millisecond later. You don't remember that at all. But if you get a postcard, what a lot of people do is they look at it, they say, that's a discount code I don't need right now, but I'll put it on my fridge. And then 1 month later, I need it and I use it. And that just doesn't happen with email.
Yeah. You're right. Cool. Very good answer. Then you've mentioned weekly customer calls. Can you share any memorable moment from those calls? Like maybe something funny, unique, surprising?
I think one example I recently had was we were talking with a customer because they're using what we do in a bit unconventional way. So usually we provide print, but they still have their own printers and they just wanted to use the software but not use the printers. And in the beginning, when I got the message about this meeting, hey, we need managing director in there. There is a huge topic. We need to take care of it. I was a bit afraid what's going on here. Are we missing something big? And then in the call itself, the interesting realization was that the way that they set up their system was that they had very strict separation between the IT and marketing teams, and the IT setup was the team we were talking to. So in the end, they just wanted to talk about a very specific encoding bug or something like that came up that wasn't super relevant, but that we needed to figure out. And for me, that was quite an interesting realization that if we look at a complex product, and especially enterprise customers, you don't have just someone using it. You have a lot of different stakeholders. They all have very, very different ways to look at it. And all of these different ways, then you need to take into consideration. Otherwise, what you're building doesn't really help.
Thanks a lot. Then, I still have a little surprise for you. I actually found a bit of a Easter egg, security hole, however you would call it, in your software. So you have an API which is used for internal purposes, which has a time machine feature. So you can send a letter to someone in the past. And I actually prepared a little Python script where we can now write a letter to yourself back in the year 2013. What would be something you would like to tell to your younger self working as a project manager at McKinsey around that time? What would you tell your younger self if you could?
I think
apart from buy Bitcoin, etc.
I think for me, one of the biggest change in how I work happened also around the time when I was at McKinsey, near the beginning. Then I realized that life is so much easier if you have a good second choice. If you know that what you're doing right now isn't the only thing that you can ever do, but you know it's great, but if this doesn't pan out, there's other options as well. Because what this led to me is that I'm a lot more open. I know that I can speak directly about things that might work or might not work. And if I come to a conflict, then it's not me on the line because I have my options. And this has made my life a lot nicer because I've been able to also say no in situations where I before would not have said no. But it also made me much more valuable towards the companies because I can now talk about the things that actually matter without needing to worry about how it affects me. So I think that's the main advice I would give is, Daniel, you will always be able to find something else. Try to be honest, try to be helpful, and just focus on the best outcome for everyone involved.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. Really interesting content you shared today, and hope to see you soon.
Thanks as well. Thanks for having me, and hope to see you soon as well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the AlphaList podcast. If you liked this episode, share it with friends. I'm sure they love it too. Make sure to subscribe so you can hear deep insights into technical leadership and technology trends as they become available. Also, please tell us if there is a topic you would like to hear more about or a technical leader whose brain you would like us to pick. AlphaList is all about helping CTOs getting access to the insights they need to make the best decisions for their company. Please send us suggestions to cto@alphalist.com, send me a message on LinkedIn or Twitter. After all, the more knowledge we bring to CTOs, the more growth we see in tech. Or, as we say on AlphaList, accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth. See you in the next episode.